Nobody's fault but mine.
Jimmy Page is a guitar god. There's no question about it. His delicious yet emotional heavy blues riffs simply groove like no others, and there's a reason he's one of the greatest guitar players from one of the greatest bands of all time, Led Zeppelin. But despite his unparalleled influence on music and the countless accolades he's achieved, there has been a dark cloud persistently showering over Jimmy's legacy, which is his contentious history as a child predator, with these hideous allegations being centred around relationships and statutory rapes of girls as young as 13 or 14 years of age. In this two-part series, we are going to do our best to ascertain and decipher whether these several claims about Jimmy's relationships are true and corroborated, despite Jimmy doing his best to hide away from these allegations, and we will set the story straight once and for all. And just before we commence, I just want to quickly say that I know some of you folks are fans of my channel for videos like the first shoegaze song, and you would like to see more introspective videos on music culture like that one. Well, don't worry, I do have more videos like that already in the works, which will be coming out in the near future, so please don't feel like I'm alienating you. I'm just on a roll with these types of videos right now, so please keep supporting the channel if that's the type of content that you're subscribed for. But anyways, back to the video. So, the first case in today's video of Jimmy's illicit relationships is that with Cindy Wells, or as she was otherwise known, Miss Cinderella. Cindy was born in January 1952 and was part of a Sunset Strip band called the GTOs, Girls Together Outrageously, who were a sort of psychedelic girl group affiliated with Frank Zappa that were active from around 1968 to 1970. While Cindy never publicly commented on her underage relationship with Jimmy before her untimely death in 1997, there are two vital pieces of evidence that corroborate the two's ostensible love affair. First then, in late 1969, a rather lewd picture of the two was shot by photographer Ron Raffaelli in New York. I will have to censor the image as both are in a state of undress, but the image depicts Cindy eating away at fruit surrounding Jimmy's crotch. The photo was meant to be a real-life metaphor of a recurring dream Jimmy had where he falls from a concert stage and is stripped of his clothes by groupies and forced to, well, liaison with said female fans. Raffaelli describes Cindy as coming in as, quote, some groupie that was hanging on to Jimmy at that moment. So, Cindy was not just some arbitrary model selected by the photographer Raffaelli for this photo shoot. She came with Jimmy as his then partner. Now, just to again clarify, Cindy was born in early 1952, and this photo was taken in 1969, so Cindy would have been just 17 here, making this image likely illegal today and gross either way, especially seeing as Jimmy would have been in his mid-20s here. Likewise, the circumstances surrounding the photo also plainly indicate that Jimmy was having a relationship with Cindy when she was 17, which in the state of California, where Cindy was from, is illegal. However, it gets much worse than this. So, Cindy married Velvet Underground band member John Cale in 1971, and the pair were married for 4 years before divorcing in 1975. John and Cindy's relationship was rocky, and John went into great detail about the pair's marriage and Cindy herself in his autobiography, What's Welsh for Zen. The autobiography is one of the best and only sources containing detailed information about Cindy, as she remains so elusive and out of the public eye for basically all of her adult life. So when John discusses moving to London from New York for the sake of his music career, he says, quote, "The move was coloured by the knowledge that Cindy knew more people in the rock business in London than I did. Having born a child out of wedlock to Jimmy Page when she was 16, the child had been given up for adoption long before I was informed of the matter, but had lingered in my mind as the difficulties mounted between us. It affected my return to London in a subtle but pernicious way. So, this means that Jimmy had a relationship with a then 16-year-old girl, and due to the obvious 10-month incubation period during pregnancy, this means that it is likely that Jimmy could have impregnated a potentially 15-year-old Cindy before then giving up the child after turning 16. And just a note, during this period, Jimmy would have been 22 or 23 years of age. Foul stuff. During my research process for the Iggy Pop expose video I uploaded a few months ago now, which I'll also leave a link to in the description and comment section below if you're interested, I came across a brief extract in the Open Up and Bleed Iggy Pop biography by Paul Trinker, which detailed that Jimmy Page and baby groupie Coral Shields had a brief relationship in the summer of 1972, at which time Coral would have been 16 years of age, as she was born in late 1955. This is well below the age of consent of 18 in California, where Coral was from, and just about legal in the UK, where the relationship seems to have occurred, though still grim seeing as Jimmy would have been 28 years of age, a whole 12 years older than the 16-year-old schoolgirl, Coral. So, the extract reads, quote, "Iggy himself seemed in decent shape, optimistic, working the band through new material, although there were the usual lapses. He'd arranged to meet Coral Shields at Kennedy Airport the afternoon of the Max's show, but forgot to turn up. Coral was in a panicky state, without the money to get into Manhattan or any idea of where the band was staying. Fortunately, a white knight appeared in the form of Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, who'd met her back at Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco in LA. Page was about to catch a plane back to London, straight after Zepp's triumphant summer tour had concluded with 3 sold-out shows at Madison Square Garden, and persuaded Coral to come back with him. Once in London, Coral would tell people like Nick Kent that she'd given up on Iggy Pop, who was more interested in drugs than in other people. And later in the book, it said that, quote, Coral had returned from her trip to London and made up with Iggy, as she arrived back in her hometown of LA around late August to early September. So, was this underage relationship a reality then? Well, I can't say that for sure. I have scoured every Jimmy Page biography, every Led Zeppelin biography, and every other reliable source to corroborate this relationship, but I have found nothing else on these two. However, what I will say is that it is a concrete fact that Coral was going to the same exclusive clubs that Jimmy would have been going to in LA in 1972 during Led Zeppelin's North American tour, namely the English Disco Club, and there are plenty of pictures of Coral at the venue, as seen in these images here. and there are numerous pictures of Jimmy also at the English disco. And in this picture here, Coral's younger sister, Sable, who regularly frequented the LA club scene with her sister, is seen in the same frame as Jimmy Page in this photograph, as I've outlined here for you to see. Furthermore, the timelines of Led Zeppelin's tour and the band travelling back to London in late summer of 1972 is well documented, and ties in exactly with the order of events in the Open Up and Bleed Iggy biography, which I just read from. And finally, Coral, who is not very vocal at all about her creepy past, has actually posted pictures of herself and her sister Sable backstage at Led Zeppelin's San Diego show in June 1972 on both her Instagram and her Facebook accounts, which at the very, very least indicate that Jimmy and Coral had at least met in some capacity during this period. So, I'll leave this one for you folks to decide on. As well as Coral, Lynn Koenigsegger, better known as Queenie or Queenie Glam, born sometime in 1958, was also a fixture of the baby groupie scene, where girls aged anywhere between 13 to 17 sought out rock stars who then took advantage of them. Queenie was a notorious member of this scene in the early 1970s, and some speculative sources have pitted her and Jimmy as having a short relationship at some point. Nevertheless, from my research, there seems to be very little to support this claim. In all the biographies, autobiographies, and interviews I've read, there is not even a suggestion that these two were together at any point. Queenie even gave an interview in May 1973 with Star magazine, where she implied having relationships with David Bowie, Mick Ronson, and Mark Bolan, but she never mentioned Jimmy or even Led Zeppelin at all, full stop. Despite the other interviewee, Sable, the sister of Coral we mentioned just before, bringing up Led Zeppelin and Robert Plant multiple times during the interview. The only evidence that suggests that anything went on between these two are a series of pictures taken in very late May 1973 at the Rainbow Club in LA, where Queenie is seen sitting on Jimmy's lap, and in the second picture, where Jimmy is playfully feeding her a drink. Though some sources suggest these photos were shot in June 1972, I have cross-referenced these against the Led Zeppelin official photo archives, which indicate that the photos were in fact taken in May 1973, around the time of their South California tour dates for the Houses of the Holy tour. So, Queenie would have been 14 or 15 years of age here. Conversely, the Star magazine interview I cited just before, where Queenie was talking about her supposed conquests of rock stars like David Bowie and Mick Ronson, would have almost certainly been conducted before the picture of Jimmy and Queenie was taken in late May. So that could be why she didn't mention Jimmy in any capacity, because she simply hadn't met him yet. This case then is inconclusive and not substantiated. But even if Jimmy did not sleep with a then likely 14 or 15-year-old Queenie, the fact he freely let her sit on his lap in such a way is completely inappropriate and disgusting either way. Jimmy clearly did not have an issue with it. Just look at these two images. The next case involves actress and model Cassandra Peterson, who's probably best known for her portrayal of Elvira in the Elvira Mistress of the Dark franchise. This case has an even darker element than the previous ones, as Cassandra alleges that Jimmy tried to sexually assault her and violate her in the worst possible way while she was still a schoolgirl. So, this incident was first brought up by Cassandra herself in a 2007 interview with Pamela DeBar in the book Let's Spend the Night Together. It takes place during the period where Jimmy was part of the Yardbirds, which was the band Jimmy was part of before Led Zeppelin, for any of you unaware. And it was around the time of a show in Colorado Springs. So I'll read the quote out for you now, but I would exclude any irrelevant details. But the full quote will be able for you to read on screen if you want to. So, after being dropped off in downtown Colorado Springs by her aunt to try and hunt down the Yardbirds, Cassandra says, quote, "We went to the first floor, second floor, third floor, systematically listening at doors until we heard somebody dorking around on a guitar. We knocked and Jim McCarty opened the door in Keith Relf's room. And they said, 'Oh, come in.' Keith was drawing designs with magic markers and gave me one. We were two hysterical little girls, practically fainting, gushing about how excited we were, acting like dweebs, and they loved it. I actually washed Jim McCarty's hair. Then Jimmy Page came in and said, 'Why don't you come to my room with me?' He was the one I liked best in the band, so I was dying. But being with Jimmy Page almost became date rape, and that phrase wasn't even invented yet. When I wouldn't do what he wanted, he got pissed off and ripped off my clothes. He didn't hurt me, he was just very insistent, and wouldn't stop when I said stop. I ran out of his room with my skirt pulled up to my waist, my sweater torn, screaming, 'I'm gonna call the police.' The elevator opened and it was full of people looking at me, with my hair a mess, my skirt hiked up, and so on. Cassie eventually reconvened with her aunt, who was waiting outside, and later says that Jimmy's member, let's call it, was the first she had ever saw, as I'll outline for you here in this quote. In 2021, Cassandra published her own memoir, Yours Cruelly, Memoirs of the Mistress of the Dark, where she again recounted this incident, mirroring almost every single facet of her original story, but adding a few extra important details that help further substantiate her gruesome allegations against Jimmy. I'll follow the same format in quoting this extract from her book, but you will again still be able to read the quote in full on screen. So, quote, "On the day the Yardbirds were able to play the City Auditorium, my best friend Kathy and I went downtown and walked from hotel to hotel to see if we could find out where the band was staying. We hit play dirt when we happened to see a couple of roadies moving equipment through the lobby of the newly renovated Antlers Hotel." Cassandra then details again about convincing her aunt to drop her and Kathy off outside the hotel, and the two getting ready for the meet-up. Continuing with the quote, Cassandra says, "While Aunt Lucci waited in the lobby, we methodically combed the hotel corridors, floor by floor, looking and listening for sounds of famousness and finally detecting the faint sound of rock music coming from one of the rooms. After locating them, we knocked on the door. After a moment, it swung open, and there was Keith Reef. Behind him on the bed sat Jim McCarty and rhythm guitarist Chris Daher. After asking for an autograph, Keith turned to the other guys and said, 'Look, a couple of birds. Come on in, girls.' Cassie then repeats the same story about Keith drawing psychedelic pictures with markers, as she did in the first extract, and describes how Kathy ended up in the bathroom, washing Jim McCarty's hair in the sink. Next comes the part about Jimmy, of which I'm going to have to paraphrase as it's too graphic for YouTube, but the full quote will still be legible in the screen cap quotes you can read here. So, Jimmy suddenly bursts into the room and without a word, he grabs Cassandra by the hand and whisks her out of the door and down the hall to his room. Jimmy then immediately proceeded to get on top of and, well, assault Cassie as he starts tugging at her jumper and undoing his fly. After panicking, Cassandra snatched her hand away from Jimmy's member and ran away from him screaming, "I'm a virgin," into an elevator full of other people while still in a state of undress. After locating her friend Kathy and getting back to her auntie waiting outside, Cassandra finishes by saying, quote, "In the end, Kathy and I escaped being raped and or murdered by strange rock gods." Clearly then, both these stories are one of the same, and there are no real inconsistencies between either of these accounts, except for some minor details, so we fundamentally cannot attack her credibility as a reliable storyteller based on that. Nevertheless, as alluded to before, Cassandra shares a few extra details in this second account that allow us to further corroborate the particulars of her story. The first of these extra pieces of information is that the Yardbirds were said to have performed in the City Auditorium, which Cassandra refers to as the City Aud in her city of Colorado Springs, the same city where she was a resident of for nearly all of her formative teenage years, and talked about at great lengths in her memoir. The second important extra detail in this account is how the Yardbirds were said to have been staying in the recently renovated Antlers Hotel. So starting first with the detail regarding the City Auditorium, I can confirm that the City Auditorium is a real venue in Colorado Springs and was a venue the Yardbirds played at on July the 19th, 1967, according to concertarchives.com anyways. And there are pictures of Jimmy and the rest of the band playing there. So, this first piece of information adds up 100%, as this was the time where Cassandra was seeing bands as a teenager, and it is the only time where the band played in Colorado Springs, full stop. Secondly, the Antlers Hotel that Cassandra asserts the Yardbirds stayed at is a real and quite famous hotel in Colorado Springs that has been around for several decades and even has its own Wikipedia page. It is also just a short journey away from the City Auditorium, so would have been an ideal place for the band to stay. Cassandra interestingly notes that the hotel was recently renovated, and from my research, this is a totally truthful affirmation, as the hotel was in fact refurbished and reopened in 1967, just before the Yardbirds would have come to Colorado Springs and stayed there in mid-July. This detail alone really adds a lot of veracity to her account, and also ensures that the time she would have come across the Yardbirds, and Jimmy in particular, would have to have been at the time of this July 1967 show. Now, the next question is, how old would Cassandra have been during this alleged attempted rape by Jimmy? Well, Cassandra was born on September the 17th, 1951, and seeing as this incident took place around July 19th, 1967, give or take a few days either way, this means Cassandra would have been just 15 years of age, whilst Jimmy would have been 23 at this time. So now we have Cassandra's story and age established. Can we fully corroborate the story? Well, what I will again say is that Cassandra's story never changes. The dates and locations add up, and there is no real reason for Cassandra to lie about this, as she would have no motive to clout chase or lie for attention, seeing as she has already had such a successful career, and is a very affluent woman. She even still speaks about Jimmy in a somewhat positive light, still admiring his musical ability. So in my eyes, there is no reason for this to be a fabricated tale, of whom she still admires as a musician so much, and equally has nothing really to gain from it in terms of attention or relevancy all these years later. Unfortunately though, Jimmy has never addressed this encounter publicly, so all we have is Cassandra's story on this. And whilst I do believe this absolutely hideous assault on a 15-year-old schoolgirl is an event that seems probable based on the information we have at hand, I cannot confirm it as 100% true. But again, I'll let you decide on the truths of this one. And with that, we'll move on to the final case in today's video. Dana Gillespie, born on the 30th of March 1949, is a British singer, songwriter and actress who has been a pretty big deal in the music industry, having contributed to the recording of over 70 albums throughout her career, after having started her career under the guise of David Bowie when she was still a young teenager. In fact, her connections in the industry lead her to releasing her first single, Thank You Boy, in 1965, when she was only 15, and the single was produced by none other than Jimmy Page. Beyond this, Dana and Jimmy have collaborated several times on other songs and albums, and have formed quite a strong creative bond, with Dana alleging in her autobiography, Weren't Born a Man, that Jimmy even personally invited her to the fabled Led Zeppelin reunion show in 2007. So clearly, the pair have a good relationship, but the roots of this bond are in fact likely centred on Jimmy's alleged predatory behaviour. So in a 2011 interview with Radio Sci, Dana discussed how in 1963, when Dana would have been 13 or 14 years of age just to note, that she was going to Ravi Shankar and Ustad Vilayat Khan concerts with Jimmy Page, who himself would have been 19 years of age at the time. After some research, whilst I cannot 100% confirm that either Ravi Shankar or Ustad Khan performed in or around London in 1963, it is well established that they both played quite regularly in London and England as a whole from the 1950s onwards. And also, in Shankar's case, he released 2 albums, one of which in 1963 and the second in 1964, that were both recorded in London, with these being India's Master Musician and In London, respectively. So it is very likely that Shankar would have performed in some capacity around the time of both these releases to support the release of the LPs. And staying on this subject, it's very well known that Jimmy was fascinated with Indian music, having spoken about his passion for it at length, and even famously saying that he owned the Indian instrument, the sitar, before George Harrison of the Beatles did, which Ravi Shankar himself tuned for Jimmy. This is a picture of Jimmy playing a sitar in 1962, just a few months before he was alleged to have gone to these concerts with Dana. And here's a lengthy post from Jimmy's official Facebook page about him flying to Bombay to expand his musical horizon and learn more about Shankar sometime in 1967. Dana, on the other hand, was and still is totally immersed in Indian music and spirituality, as she has been a follower of the Indian spiritual Shri Sathya Sai Baba, and has recorded 13 bhajan-based albums in Sanskrit. So the likelihood that these two will be going to these types of concerts at this point in time is, well, almost a complete certainty. Also, Dana has made many further comments about going to these concerts with Jimmy. For example, in a 2013 interview, she noted how she used to go with Jimmy Page to listen to every Indian concert that came to town, like the early tours of Ravi Shankar. Also, in an interview with Narendra Kusna, Dana said how her exposure to Indian music came through Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, as he called her to a show by Vilayat Khan and Ravi Shankar. And in her 2021 autobiography, Weren't Born a Man, she said that she and Jimmy had similar interests in Indian music, and they would sometimes go to see Vilayat Khan or Ravi Shankar in concert. Now at this point, you're probably wondering why I'm talking so extensively about this particular subject, as even though a 19-year-old man going to several concerts with a 13 or 14-year-old girl is weird and inappropriate in itself, this is not evidence of anything physical actually happening between the two. Well, this ostensibly friendly dynamic between the two shifted in Dana's autobiography, as she candidly said that, quote, although she knew she was not a big love in Jimmy's life, that they did have a bit of a thing going for a time, on a no-strings-attached basis. Whilst no age is strictly given about when this relationship started, it can be implied from the chronology of Dana's autobiography that it started for her somewhere between the ages of 14 to 16, though I will stress that I cannot ascertain this detail 100%. Jimmy would have been between the ages of 20 to 22 at this time. This 2021 article by The Spectator extrapolates from her autobiography that she was in fact 16 when she slept with a then 22-year-old Jimmy, but I do feel this is a slightly more conservative estimate, but still demonstrates the gross and illicit age gap between the two. Again, like the other cases discussed today, Jimmy has made no comment on this relationship, but there is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that these two intertwined at some point, whilst Dana was still very young. Her connections in the music industry, and to Jimmy personally in her early teens, are very well documented, and the time frame she details for seeing these Indian musicians in concerts with Jimmy, as well as Jimmy's well-known fondness for Indian music, are fully corroborate. Likewise, in a similar vein to the Cassandra Peterson case from before, Dana is not in a position where she would need to lie about things like this. She has had a successful career, I imagine is quite wealthy, and is totally immersed in her spirituality and internal zen, and is also still clearly on friendly terms with Jimmy. So I don't feel like she'd want to defame Jimmy in any way. If anything, I feel like she may have held back on her admissions about her relationship with Jimmy, so as not to compromise the two's friendship, and inadvertently expose him for having relations with a potentially then schoolgirl. These two were clearly connected to some degree, and I'll leave it at that. Well, that is the end of part 1, folks, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Part 2 will be coming out soon, and will be mostly centred on Jimmy's most infamous alleged relationship with a 14-year-old girl. If you're still here, would you mind leaving a like on the video if you think it's worth it, as I have many more videos like this one today in the works, and already on the channel, including critical exposés on Anthony Kiedis, Iggy Pop, David Bowie, Steve Albini, Björk, and many others, all of which will be linked in both the description tab and the comment section below. Also, please leave a comment if you've got anything at all you'd like to share, whatever your take is, and I'll try my hardest to get back to as many of you folks as I can. And finally, always remember to subscribe to the Sing Swan Song.